In this video, we are going to talk about how prokaryotes metabolize, meaning how they acquire nutrients and energy. So first, let's review what this term metabolism means. So metabolism just refers to all of the chemical reactions that occur inside a cell or organism. Now, these metabolic reactions may be anabolic or catabolic. And anabolic means to build something, and catabolic means to break down. So you can see in this picture here, anabolic, we see these smaller molecules, which oftentimes these are monomers. So things like monosaccharides, amino acids, nucleotides, all of these monomers that you probably learned about when you learned about macromolecules, which are polymers. And so these monomers, and there has to be an input of energy during anabolism. So energy plus monomers, they're able to form these bonds, chemical bonds, in between the monomers to make a polymer. Now, catabolism is just the opposite. We could actually just draw a backwards arrow and call it catabolism. But we also show catabolism in this picture down here, where we take a larger molecule, which is oftentimes a polymer. We break those bonds to form our individual monomers or smaller molecules, and then we get an output of energy in the process. So as you can see, these metabolic reactions involve a transfer of nutrients. And so these nutrients are in the form of things like atoms. So we may be talking about carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, etc., and or molecules. And oftentimes we are talking about those macromolecules, which include things like carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. There's also a transfer of energy, because remember, with an anabolic reaction, there has to be an input of energy to form those bonds. And in a catabolic reaction, we have a release or an output of energy. You may also recall that anabolic reactions occur through a process known as dehydration synthesis. Which is also called a condensation reaction. And it's not shown in this graphic here, but ultimately there would also be a molecule of water produced in this process. Now for catabolism, this would be a hydraulic reaction or hydrolysis. And there would have to be an input of water. So you would actually have a water molecule on the left side of the arrow that goes into helping to break down that polymer into its smaller components. Now, all living organisms need nutrients, and some nutrients they need more than others. And so first we're going to look at the macronutrients, and macro just means large. This is the kind of the greater amount. So they need a relatively large amount of these particular nutrients. And so the most abundant elements that we find in living organisms, we can use this mnemonic of CHOMPs, if you will. And that's just made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Now, some other macronutrients that are still needed in a macro amount, but they're still less abundant than the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, etc., are things like potassium, magnesium, calcium, and sodium. Now, all living organisms, including prokaryotes, also require what we call micronutrients. And these are needed in really small or even what we call trace amounts. So we need very, very little amounts of these nutrients to stay alive. Even though these nutrients are only needed in small amounts, they are still required for survival. So if an organism does not have these, it can still cause major problems and lead to death. So some examples of micronutrients that prokaryotes need are things like iron. And they need this for electron transport reactions, which are involved in energy exchange. Prokaryotes also need boron, chromium, and manganese as enzyme cofactors. Remember, a cofactor is something that just helps an enzyme work. So if you recall, we'll do a quick review. We have an enzyme here. And enzymes have an active site that a substrate has to be able to bind to. Now, a cofactor is something that is going to help to essentially change the shape of this active site so that the substrate can then also fit into that active site and be catalyzed by the enzyme. So the cofactor is just something that changes the shape of the active site to allow the substrate to then bond to the enzyme. Now, there are different metabolic strategies that living organisms can do in order to obtain nutrients, and we're going to specifically focus on carbon and energy. And here are just some of the strategies. So we have chemoheterotrophs, chemoautotrophs, photoheterotrophs, and photoautotrophs. And we can break down these words into their smaller components to better understand what they mean. So first of all, chemo means chemical. Whereas photo means light. And more specifically, it's light from the sun. Now, hetero or heterotroph, so hetero means other, and troph means eater. So a heterotroph is an other eater, meaning it is an organism that eats something else in order to get its energy. Whereas an autotroph, auto means self, and troph means to eat. So this is a self-eater or self-feeder, meaning that it can make its own food. So taking another look at those kind of components of the word. So remember we said photo means that the organism gets its energy from the sun. Chemo means that the organism is getting its energy from chemicals. Auto means self, and so these are organisms that can make their own food, and more specifically, they make their food using carbon from carbon dioxide. And you're probably familiar with photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is a process that photoautotrophs go through. And what they do is they take carbon dioxide plus some water. You add some sunlight in there, and they can make things like glucose and oxygen in the process. Hetero means other, and so organisms that get their carbon from organic compounds, and this means eating other things. So eating other organisms. And then troph just means a feeder. It means to feed or to eat. So this chart kind of puts it all together. So looking first at our chemoautotrophs. So remember, chemo means chemicals. So organisms that are chemoautotrophs are going to get their energy from chemicals. They're going to get their carbon from inorganic compounds. And some examples of chemoautotrophs include bacteria that can oxidize hydrogen, sulfur, iron, nitrogen, and carbon monoxide. And these are organisms that are often found near deep sea hydrothermal vents. And these deep sea hydrothermal vents are an ecosystem that do not have access to sunlight. So they're very deep in the sea. Light doesn't reach that far. So these organisms cannot be photoautotrophs, but they can be chemoautotrophs. And they often get their energy source, when we say chemicals, most of them come from these inorganic chemicals that are found near these deep sea hydrothermal vents. Chemoheterotrophs, once again, they're going to get their energy from chemicals, and they get their carbon from organic compounds. And so this essentially means eating other organisms. So for example, animals, we are animals. And so humans are chemoheterotrophs. So we have to eat other organic compounds. We have to eat plant and animal matter, which those are both made up of carbohydrates and proteins and lipids. And we are able to extract energy from those compounds and also break down those compounds into their molecular and atomic structures and be able to get those nutrients that way as well. So most fungi and most protozoa are also chemoheterotrophs, and most bacteria are chemoheterotrophs as well, especially pathogenic bacteria. So these are bacteria that are eating or kind of feeding on an organic compound and making that organism sick in the process. Another example of chemoheterotrophic bacteria are going to be the decomposers. And so these are organisms that break down other dead organic organisms in order to essentially recycle their energy and nutrients. Now, photoautotrophs, they get their energy from light. So remember, photo means light. They get their carbon from inorganic compounds, and more specifically, this carbon dioxide. And this is what we were talking about with photosynthesis. So these are the organisms that conduct photosynthesis. And so some non-bacterial examples are things like plants and algae, but there are also bacteria that can go through this process of photosynthesis. So cyanobacteria, it used to be called blue-green algae, but that's not really a correct name for it. So cyanobacteria can do photosynthesis, and also green and purple sulfur bacteria are able to do photosynthesis as well. And then photoheterotrophs are able to get energy from light, but carbon from organic compounds. And some examples are green and purple non-sulfur bacteria. So overall, with living organisms, chemoheterotrophs and photoautotrophs are the more common metabolic strategies. But as you can see, these other ones do exist. Prokaryotic metabolism can also be aerobic, meaning that oxygen is required, or anaerobic, meaning that oxygen is not required. And there are some prokaryotes that are actually obligate aerobes, which means that they can only do aerobic respiration. And if they lack oxygen, they will die. There are also obligate anaerobes, which can only do anaerobic respiration. And if they are exposed to oxygen, then they are actually killed by the presence of oxygen. And then lastly, there are facultative anaerobes, which can do either process. So if oxygen is present, they can obtain their carbon energy aerobically. But if oxygen is not present, they can use anaerobic processes in order to get carbon and energy.